And get underway. Good afternoon and welcome to the Alfred University Bergren Forum. My name is John Angelo and I am a professor of chemistry and the coordinator for the spring 2024 season of the Bergren Forum. Today is March 14th, 2024. And for those of you attending online here in Western New York, it is a beautiful spring night day, the kind of day that is better to be outside. But here inside Nevins Theater, the Powell Campus Center, we have something interesting to hear about, along with some free coffee. Before starting, we have first next Thursday's forum with the professor of physics and astronomy, Joshua Thomas. His talk will be on the upcoming school. There are some other events this week announced. First, the student activity board is hosting a Lego on Saturday, March 16th at 7 p.m. in the nightclub. And also, Margot Wallace's solo exhibition for Frolic will open tomorrow, March 20th at 6 p.m. in the Robert C. Turner Catwalk. And on the same day, also in the Robert C. Turner Gallery, Quinn Ryan's Work in Progress will open. Finally, 2010 Alfred University alum Megan Galloway will deliver the Riley Lecture in Women's and Gender Studies on March 18th at 5:30 in the Powell Campus Center's nightclub, which is directly above where we currently are. Today's forum will be given by Laura Johnson, Director of Education Abroad here at Alfred University, and the title of Laura's talk is Why Europe, Shifting Trends in Study Abroad. Take it away.
All right, so thank you. Like you said, my topic is on shifting trends in study abroad, and I have three main goals for this talk. So basically to go over one, where are American students studying abroad? Then why do we as a field think that they're choosing the locations that they're choosing over other options? And then what are the effects? What are the consequences of having so many students go to one particular area? So as you can see from the title, the grand majority of American students decide to go to Europe. We know this because the State Department actually sponsors a survey that goes out around this time every single year to all the higher education institutions in the US to measure how many students are we sending, where are they going, what are they doing, how long are they spending, things like that. So we have really detailed data on exactly where people are going. As for preference for Europe, though, it's not a small preference. So the last year we have data for us, 2021, 2022. And in that year, about 73% of students went to Europe. Now that's the entire European continent. So from Ireland, UK, Spain, Italy, all the way over to Belarus, Romania, Latvia, Estonia, places like that. Still, it's enormous, given that Europe isn't geographically that large of a place. So there are all of these students flooding into the European continent. That's over 130,000 in that particular year, and that's just the American students. There are also international students from other places that are also in Europe. So major European cities are students. Second destination, most popular destination, so Latin America, 10%, Asia, Africa. This data is a little bit skewed because since it was 2021, 2022, it's right after the pandemic. Oceania, the blue line on the pie graph, covers Australia, New Zealand, Fiji, Micronesia, places like that. In that year, they still had some entry requirements. They normally rank higher. Other than that, this is pretty much par for the course for what American study abroad looks like. Directly before the pandemic, so 2018, 2019, it was down to 56% of students going to Europe, but that was still almost 200,000. And still a vast majority of the American student population that was going there. The earliest date that I actually have data for which students are going to which region is about in the mid-80s. From the mid-80s forward, the percentage of US students going to Europe has never dropped below 50%. Flat out, it just hasn't. The lowest year was in 2014 because in the early 2000s, there was a trend where students were a little bit more open to going new places. There was a little bit more diversity of destinations. But since 2014, the number of students going to Europe has only increased every single year. So this is a long-standing trend, and it doesn't look like it's going anywhere, to be frank. To dive a little bit deeper as to where they're going in Europe, though, in this particular year, the top destinations were Italy, Spain, the UK, and France. These 4 countries, out of all the European countries, are pretty much always the top destinations for American students. They jostle a little bit. Sometimes one is on top, sometimes a different year, the next one might be. But it's almost always those specific 4 locations. And frankly, this 56% is probably an undercount. If you look at the top of the pie graph there, that brown chunk for multiple destinations, those are programs that start in one country, go to the next and the next and the next country over the course of the program. The grand majority of those are in Europe. So a good chunk of that can just be added on to the green percentage of students going to Europe. So it's a huge number and a huge preference for the European continent. So why? Why do so many students choose to go to Europe? Well, it makes sense if you look at the historical picture. So international education as an idea is frankly old. We have records of students studying abroad from foreign sources in ancient Greece. They were traveling from different countries. The earliest named student we know of who studied abroad was in 1190, and he studied in Oxford, and he walked. So it took him a long time to get there. An interesting correlation you see in historical study abroad, though, deals with colonies and former colonizers. So if you look at the early American colonies, the grand majority of students who wanted to get in higher education went back to either the UK or to whatever European country their family was originally from. So that's enormously common if you look at old American records. It's not just the American colonies, though. If you look at old, say, records of French colonies, so Algeria, the Caribbean, the Indochinese Peninsula, Vietnam, places like that, you see the exact same thing. So they sent most of their students to France, the former colonizer, and the trend continues to this day. There's a lot of bad blood between some of the former French colonies and current France. They still send their students there in essentially a vast majority of numbers. They all go to France for their higher education. So it's not causation, but it's definitely a historical correlation that's interesting to see. One difference between these students and modern study abroad students, though, is that most students from, say, 1700s, the early 1800s, went abroad for their entire degree. So nowadays, students spend, say, a semester, a full year, maybe 2 weeks in the summer going for a study abroad program. These students left, did their entire degree abroad, and came back because for a lot of them, there simply weren't the higher education institutions in their home country to support that kind of thing. That changed in the late 1800s. So that's when there were more US institutions of higher education, and they started moving to a credit model. So the students could go abroad, take classes, come back, and actually get credit towards their degree at an American institution. And a lot of these early study abroad programs were faculty-led, they were summer programs, and most of them went to Europe. They continued building on that tradition of where they had connections, of where they regularly sent students, and they brought their students back to Europe. It's not all of the programs. There were some of these early programs that went to places like Venezuela, but again, a grand majority. The idea of modern study abroad, as we now think of it, sort of kicked off after the Great World Wars, so World War I, World War II. In this time period, the perspective around study abroad kind of changed. So previously, it had more been a fad item, something that students do in the summer because it looks fun and they have a professor they know that they want to go with. After the World Wars, it was more seen as a way to promote peace. So promoting understanding between different cultures, making sure people know the language and can communicate across those cultures as a way of keeping the peace and ensuring that we didn't have any more wars like this. And it wasn't just the universities that were getting in on it at that point, it was the government. So this is when the US government started funding study abroad programs. They started funding scholarships. They created an entirely new class of immigrant visas. So if you guys know any international students here at AU, they're probably here on a non-immigrant student visa. Those were created after World War II to try and promote understanding between cultures. So again, study abroad really takes off at this point. And since they were looking at promoting peace, once again, they push students to go to Europe because that's where they're worried about and that's where they want to prevent wars. So historically, it makes sense, but students these days don't necessarily make decisions based on ancient historical factors. So the historical piece is the subcontext. These are some other factors that I see on a more day-to-day basis and that other people in the field have mentioned. So the top one that I see is there's this perception that if you study abroad in Europe, you don't need to speak a second language. The idea that English will get you through and that you don't have to push and learn that second language, that you'll be fine. That plays out, that's okay in some cases. In a lot of the major European capitals, they're used to a lot of tourists from the US, from the UK. So some students really can get by with just their English skills. If they go to southern France, southern Italy, Latvia, it's not going to happen. You really do need to know the local language, but the perception remains, and thus a lot of students push for European destinations because they think it'll be easier. Another big one is the languages students already know. So the languages we teach students in high school is really how we're prepping them to go abroad once they get to college. And the main ones taught in US high schools are Spanish, French, German, and Latin. Now, Spanish makes sense. We have Mexico on the southern border. It makes sense. We want to have a lot of Spanish speakers so that we can work with our neighbors. It's logical. French is a little more interesting. So you would think that it would make sense, given Quebec is on our northern border, that students would learn Quebecois, Canadian French. No American high schools teach Canadians French. They just don't. They teach European French, which logically doesn't flow, but we have that preference for the European language. And so instead of teaching something that will let them work with our northern neighbor, we teach the European version. German, again, it makes sense. Lots of students are interested in German. And then we have Latin. So Latin is a really useful language if you're going into science, if you're going into law, a lot of these pieces. So it really can help the students. It's still a dead language though. So we're teaching a dead language more commonly than we teach Chinese. So again, that definite preference for European languages, and we're setting them up to go to these countries, just by the fact of our educational system and where we're pushing the students to go. Another factor I commonly hear is about safety. So this is from students and it's from their parents. There is that perception out there that Europe is safer than other study abroad destinations. If you looked up a list of the safest places to travel to in the world, Scandinavia would probably be on the list. Sweden, Norway, Iceland, places like that. It is very safe. That being said, it's not necessarily safer than some other parts of the world, but we have that perception, whether it comes from media, whether it comes from people we know, that Europe is naturally a safer destination. So the students gravitate towards it and their parents nudge them towards it too, which has a big impact on what the students decide. And then the last one I wanted to touch on was word of mouth. So there are essentially two factors on this. The first is social media. If Italy is really popular on TikTok right now, I'm going to have a lot more students coming in wanting to go to Italy. If Instagram is flooded with pictures of Spanish beaches, the students are going to want to go to Spain. So that influence makes a huge difference on what students decide to do. As a field, we're actually adjusting how we prepare students to go abroad to say what you've seen on Instagram is not necessarily the same as what you're going to see when you get there. Social media is curated. It's people are looking for the best possible angle. Make sure to do your research because it's not going to be the same. Because otherwise, students really do get to their study abroad program and think it's going to be exactly like what they saw online. The other factor of word of mouth is just people who've gone abroad, who enjoyed their time, and who come back and tell all their friends. So this is sometimes students, sometimes it's parents who've told their kids about where they studied abroad as a college student. And the student says, you know, they had a really great time. I want to go there. This is one of those geometric progression pieces. So one student comes back, they had a good time, they tell 10 of their friends, three of their friends go, they come back, they tell even more of their friends, and it just builds. So popular destinations tend to continue to get more popular just by word of mouth. So that's some of the main reasons why people choose to go to Europe, as far as we as a field can figure out. As for the effects, there are pros and cons to sending that many students to one continent. So one of the positives is that, like I said, students feel comfortable going there. They feel confident in their ability to complete a study abroad program successfully. They think that they're going to have a good time, and thus they are empowered to actually go. They actually have the experience, they step outside of their comfort zone, and they're able to get international experience as a college student. So that's amazing. It does tend to lead to over-tourism, though. So I mentioned with those surveys that came out that the US State Department conducts of how long students are spending in a particular country. There has been a distinct move over the last few years where students aren't studying abroad for a semester as much anymore. They're certainly not studying abroad for a year as much anymore. Instead, they're going for short-term programs. So that's 2 weeks to 2 months in the summer or over Allen term. And by going on a shorter term program, they're not as integrated with the local population, and they compete with the tourists for resources. Most major European capitals are already swamped with tourists. So if you add in the study abroad students on top of that, there's even more people looking for space to visit cultural monuments, to take up public transportation, short-term rentals, hotels, things like that. So it's squeezing on their, essentially their capacity as a city to cope with incoming foreigners. One of the big things of that over-tourism piece that's actually becoming an issue in study abroad right now is the housing piece. So most study abroad programs and all of the ones that AU sponsors ensure that if you get accepted into the program, you're going to have a place to stay. So we already have a room for you. It's already set. You don't have to worry about where you're going to live when you land. That's becoming less common. With a lot of major destinations, major universities, they're not guaranteeing housing anymore. They say, come, we'll give you a spot in the program. When you get here, you have to find your own housing from the rental market in the city. That's rough on the students. So maybe they don't find housing right away. Maybe they are not as experienced looking for housing in that country and they get themselves stuck in a predatory lending agreement. Things like that. It has happened, and it's becoming more and more of a problem because the universities just don't have the space anymore, but they keep accepting more and more students. Different governments around the world are handling the issue differently. So for example, Ireland is in a massive housing crunch right now. So the government is really focusing on building as much housing as they possibly can to cover the international students and to make sure that the international students don't push out their own local population, because that's been happening. The locals can't get into the rental market anymore. It's just too full. A different tack that Italy is using is something called the Barilla. So that is essentially a registration requirement where the Italian government says if you want to run a study abroad program in Italy, you have to register with the government, tell us all the names of your students who are coming into Italy, register your organization with us. And it sounds simple, but the simple logistical requirements of going through the consulates, getting all your translations, walking through the process adds up to about $10,000 to register a program in Italy. That is an enormous barrier when a lot of study abroad offices just don't have those resources, so less people are going to Italy, and that's how they're managing having too many students. They're just weeding out different study abroad programs. It works, but it's harder on the students who really do want to go. Another issue that sometimes comes up with sending so many students to Europe is surprisingly from the point of view of our own government. So, like I mentioned before, the US government funds scholarships for American students to study abroad. They will give extra money to a student who says they're going to study a critical need language. The State Department essentially has a list of 15 languages that they say we need more people to speak in terms of national security. So whether they need more people to speak it so that they can work in government jobs, so that they can liaise with industry, work in businesses, things like that. But we as a society need more people to speak these languages, and there are 15 on the list. Of the ones on the list, only 2 are European languages, Russian and Portuguese. Everything else is things like Arabic, Farsi, Baja Indonesian, Japanese, Chinese, Korean, things like that. So the places we're sending students is not helping our government's push to get more people to study these languages in the interest of national security. It's a work in progress. They're trying. They keep sending more and more money to entice people to study these languages. But as far as the numbers go, they're just less popular destinations. And then the last thing I wanted to go over was sort of the effects on intercultural understanding of sending so many people to one part of the world. So again, a lot of the European places that we send students are some of our closest allies. So it's good that we have students who are going there, who are developing an understanding of these cultures, who are sharing an authentic look at American culture, so that people can really get an understanding in Europe of what it's like to be American, and to share that understanding and to grow connections. So that's really important. It does tend to leave us with a Western-centered view of the world by just sending 73% of our students to what we would classify as Western countries. By doing that, we miss a lot of perspectives. So the biggest one that I tend to run into with my students involves individualism versus a communal worldview. So a lot of Western countries put individual rights high. That's some of the most important things for us in a legal point of view, and just from a cultural perspective. The individual rights matter. In some parts of the world, the rights of the community rank higher than the rights of the individual. That's just how they do things. So if we as a society don't have a lot of people with experience working in that worldview, it puts us at a disadvantage when dealing with a lot of different parts of the world, because we just don't, as a society, have that experience and understand that perspective to be able to understand and to be able to work with that portion of the world. There's also field-specific perspectives that we miss. So international business, that's a big one. People do business differently in different parts of the world. You have to know the ground rules. And so we have a lot of business ties with all different parts of the world. If we don't have people who know how to work in those environments, we're stuck. And that's going to lead to a lot of miscommunications and a lot of trouble establishing those connections. Politics. If you're planning to work in international politics, you really need that broader perspective. And it's not just the obvious fields that you would think would need an international perspective. There's also things like biology, engineering, having that international experience makes our graduates more competitive. I worked at an engineering school in France for a few years. Their students were required to spend 10, 12 weeks abroad to get their degree. It's just part of their course. So our students, if they don't have that, compared with the student from this school, they're a little bit behind as to what they have on their resume. And then the last piece that I wanted to touch on is the idea of decolonialism. So this is becoming more common in the education abroad field right now, as to something we're aiming for. It's essentially the idea that instead of focusing our studies and our narrative on essentially former colonizers, so Europe, frankly, the US, and saying that these are the perspectives we listen to, changing things around and looking at things from the perspective of people in a country that was colonized. What is their perspective on politics? What is their perspective on business? What is their perspective on any of these fields? Because their voices have often been marginalized in the past. So trying to bring forward these marginalized voices and to encourage more diversity, more inclusion from these sectors of the world. Particularly the ones we're focusing on these days are Africa and Latin America, trying to have more perspectives coming from these areas. Because if no one studies abroad there, we're missing that perspective. So overall, it is great that the students are going to Europe. It is great that they're getting the chance to study abroad. They're really having good experiences. That's awesome. As a society, we might be a little bit better off if we were better rounded in where we were sending students, because we as a society would be better rounded in our intercultural understanding. But it's a work in progress. We're working on it. We'll do our best.
We do have time for questions. What questions for Laura?
Laura, that connection you made with post-World War II and the Fulbright was really interesting because we found that with the students who were applying for Fulbrights. France, Germany, and Britain were always the most popular countries, and we would try to encourage students to apply other places, and it was really difficult because there's less competition, right?
Yeah.
I have two questions. I'm wondering, in the time that you've been here at Alfred, have you seen any change in the level of confidence or the willing to take risk? And then when you're talking about this encouragement towards that, do you have suggestions? What have you thought about in terms of what we ought to be doing?
Yeah. So unfortunately, over the time I've been here, I've actually seen a decrease in the comfort students have with going to non-European destinations. Particularly post-pandemic, students are really restricting where they're comfortable going, and they're saying, nope, I really want to go to Europe. I'm not willing to look outside of it. So that's somewhat in backlash from the pandemic. But hopefully as we move past that, students will get a little bit more comfortable going to other locations again. As for promoting decolonialism, what I've usually seen, every institution does it a little bit differently. It's somewhat liaising with faculty to say, if you're teaching a class on, say, African studies or South America, something like that, can we promote study abroad in your class, something like that, to give students the idea that this really is possible and you can study abroad in this location and it can be a good experience. So opening that point of view. And then also it's just a matter of marketing. So marketing to the students, pushing forward these less popular destinations, and then working with parents to say that there are good programs in this area of the world, your child will be safe here, and they can have a really good experience.
Do you have safety statistics about those less popular destinations? So that I don't know if that's even appropriate to use with parents or anybody, but this is a way to back up some of the push to those who China would.
Yeah.
President.
For the sake of people on Zoom, there was a question about safety statistics and dispelling the perception that Europe's the only safe place, if I can paraphrase.
So definitely. So we base a lot of our security decisions on what the State Department says. That's the first line of defense. So what does the State Department say about this particular location? Do they say you only have to exercise normal precautions, or do they say it has increased risk? So if parents have a lot of questions, that's one of the first places I suggest going to look to get more information. Also talking to students who've come back. So student testimonials matter in dispelling that point of view. And then also if a student's concerned about something particular in an area, or a parent is concerned about something particular in an area, sometimes it also helps to connect them to the staff on the ground in that country and say, okay, have you experienced problems with this before? What is the security situation like in your neighborhood? Can you tell us about it? So that firsthand experience.
I have two kids. One studied in Argentina, the other studied in Australia. Very safe and very, very, my children were very, positive about their experience. I have two questions. My first question is a simple one, which is what percentage of AU students will study abroad?
Oh gosh, I don't know that one. I could send it to you later once I look up the once I do the math.
Well, I mean, I asked the question in part because I had done a part of an evaluation team at a college in Philadelphia, Arcadia College, and over 66% of their students, 2/3 of their students were doing study abroad. They weren't required to do it, but they were certainly encouraged. And as I say, a very, very large percentage did wind up going abroad. My impression at AU is probably something in the neighborhood of maybe 5%. And I wonder if, perhaps there are things that we can do to improve that percentage. The other question I have has to do with a comment that you made regarding, international understanding. After World War I, for instance, there was a real push in this country to get students to do study abroad. We hadn't done it very much, certainly not systematically, before World War I. And so we wound up sending plenty of students abroad after World War I. And among other things, 20 years later, we declared war on Germany, on Italy, and Japan. So my question is, is there any real evidence that study abroad programs, whether we're talking about our students going abroad or there's other students coming here, does in fact promote international understanding and peace?
Yeah, absolutely. So for your first question about the percentage of students, so it is a lower percentage. What we're doing to try to increase the number of students who are studying abroad right now is reaching out earlier in their college career process. So presenting in first-year seminars, presenting in Common Ground, things like that, because a lot of the students, particularly when I just started here, weren't aware that they could study abroad, weren't aware that it could fit in with their degree, weren't aware that they had time for it or that they could afford it. So trying to get the message out early and encourage more people to start thinking about it early, that's the main tack I'm taking to try and increase our numbers right now. For actually whether there's evidence about whether it promotes international peace and things like that, like you said, it's a mixed bag. It does definitely promote understanding. So it does promote language learning, people who are capable of working with other countries, people who have that experience to work with another country. That definitely does happen. Whether we can influence the governments to not go to war with each other, well, it depends on who's in charge of the government that day.
I actually have two and you might not have data for, and if you don't, I apologize.
No, it's good.
One, how does the study abroad profiles of other countries compare with the US?
Mhm.
And do you know what the at least approximate study abroad at students being here from abroad is roughly by at least region, if not country?
So for the study abroad profiles for other countries, it depends largely on region. So particularly European countries, they have a lot of students who study abroad because they have the Erasmus program. Essentially, what that is European universities accept students from anyone else in the Erasmus network to swap, and they already have pre-existing agreements on how the credit will transfer. So it's a very detailed system. Tons of students go through the Erasmus program every year. Other than that, one of the main reasons people in other regions of the world choose to study abroad, it can be job training. It can be looking for new opportunities. Sometimes people want to work in the country that they're studying abroad in. But as for which country or which region of the world sends the most study abroad students out, it's definitely Europe and the Erasmus network. As for the number of study abroad students here, or rather incoming international students, it's been shifting recently. So my office doesn't deal with the incoming students anymore. But from what I understand, we've been changing our recruitment targets and where we're recruiting students from, because different countries are sending more students to the US and other countries are falling off. Big news right now is that China is sending out less students. So American universities are getting less Chinese students into their enrollment programs, whereas India is sending more. So it fluctuates depending on what's popular at that time period.
Thanks, Laura. That was really interesting presentation. Are there a few programs in non-European countries that you know of that you think are really good that we might suggest to students if they start talking about study abroad and we're just having casual conversations and hoping to expand the options that they're thinking about?
Yeah, definitely. So there is a study abroad for liberal arts, study abroad for business, study abroad for engineering, study abroad for art and design flyers that are out there. So if you're interested and you want to talk to students about it, they all have lists of good programs for each of those colleges. As for interesting programs right off the top of my head, we have a student in Japan this semester at Kansai Gaida University in Japan. That's a really amazing opportunity. She gets to learn Japanese, take a broad variety of courses, and Japan's super safe. There's a program in Costa Rica that costs less than $12,000 a semester without aid. And that's right in San Jose. So if they're looking for less expensive options, South America is a good place to go, just from a cost of living standpoint. If there's anyone interested in sciences specifically, Botswana is amazing. So Botswana, just north of South Africa, the university in the capital city has an enormous science and engineering program. And they're one of the top universities in Africa. It's an English-speaking country, and it's a great opportunity.
There is a question on Zoom that will have somebody unmuted now, I hope.
I don't know. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I was trying to type it all out, but this is a lot. So, Laura, thank you for your important presentation. I really appreciate all the insights on the study abroad patterns and kind of trying to understand why students go where they do and where, the reasons why they don't go to other places. And I'm really interested in your comments on the US government's role in influencing this. As you know, I traveled to Puerto Rico last year to look into the feasibility of developing a short-term study abroad program for our students there. And I thought that would be a really easy entry point for students who are less comfortable traveling abroad for the first time, because they don't need to have a passport. It's a US territory. We can speak English there, just a lot of reasons. But while I was there, I determined that due to ongoing infrastructure issues, it's not really a very feasible place for a study abroad program. And I was disappointed because this is something that is under the purview of the US government. And at the same time, I've been traveling to Nicaragua for 20 years, and I've watched the infrastructure continuously improve there to the point that it's much more comfortable to go there. And it feels much safer, and traveling there is easier than in Puerto Rico. But because of the US government's relationship with the Nicaraguan government, the US government has placed economic sanctions on Nicaragua and has put up travel warnings saying that, laws are randomly enforced in ways that are inappropriate and it's dangerous there. And in my own travels, I've seen that that's not true. It's very much political stuff that's happening between the two governments. So I think this is another interesting aspect of just how the US government influences these various patterns. And I don't know if you have heard students or anybody talking about that in the field, if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So the political aspect of where the government puts travel warnings and where they don't is enormous in the study abroad field. It's not just Nicaragua. China is currently at a level 3, so they're at a reconsider travel level. A lot of U.S. study abroad, U.S. institutions and their study abroad departments canceled programs to China when it went to a level 3. Some of that is political, some of it's genuine concern, but how much is one, how much is the other? It's hard to say on the ground. So we do take a comprehensive suite of factors into account when looking at where to send students. So the State Department warning is one aspect. We also look at where do you want to go in the country? What do you want to do while you're there? What's the infrastructure? Things like that. So it all feeds in, but you're right. If the US government puts sanctions or puts a higher travel warning on a particular country for political reasons, it has an enormous impact on the students.
Laura, thanks a lot for your presentation. It was really interesting, and you know how important I think it is. A couple of questions. Are short-term faculty student trips abroad defined as study abroad?
Definitely, yeah.
Say a 10-day or 2-week trip is study abroad.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you. And what percentage of this huge increase of students going to Europe would fall into that very short-term faculty student travel?
I'd have to look at the actual data. I have it all written out somewhere. I could send it to you, but it's definitely increasing. So year-long study abroad programs is down to like 2%
right
of the study abroad students. Semester is also significantly down, whereas summer programs has just shot through the roof. I don't have the exact numbers, but it's moving in that direction.
And what's your opinion about those short-term programs versus a semester program?
So what I tend to see is with the short-term programs, they're a good way for students to get their feet wet. So if they've never traveled abroad before, if they're not really sure about going abroad for a long period of time, maybe no one in their family has gone abroad before. It's a good way for them to try it out, make sure they like traveling, and to really build confidence in the students. A lot of students I have who go on the short-term programs come back and then they want to go on a longer-term program. So it helps in building confidence. It's not as good, of course, as you know, in building intercultural understanding, certainly not for language learning. So it's kind of an entry.
And my other question, which I've asked you several times, every time you speak to my classes about study abroad,
Mm-hmm.
For decades, far more women than men have studied abroad.
Yeah.
And is that changing, and has that been the case at Alfred University for our students studying abroad?
Yeah. So definitely, yes, far more women go abroad than men. That unfortunately is not changing. It's still the rule that women are much more likely, where the male students usually stay in the US. Yeah, definitely. So first of all, that's not necessarily the case at Alfred University. Surprisingly, we're an outlier. We have a lot of male students going abroad. So that's actually one place that we've done actually really well. The reasons in the field, there's conflicting studies as to why that is. Some say the male students are less willing to leave their social structure. Their friends, they don't want to leave their friends behind. They don't want to leave their routine behind. And they're just not as comfortable stepping outside of their normal standard way of operating. There's also the fact that a lot more women study languages. So given that a lot of students who do study languages go abroad, we're naturally pushing more women into studying abroad in that way. A lot of, say, engineering students are male. We're trying to get more women to study engineering, but still a lot of the engineering students are male. Not as many engineers study abroad. It's a more complicated field to study abroad with. You have to find really specific classes. And so I think it's a confluence of factors there.
We do have another question on Zoom from Elise.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. And I'm sorry if this has been answered in some way already. Someone was just talking about the short-term programs that are led by faculty at AU. You also mentioned earlier decolonialism. I was wondering if the programs, the short terms abroads that were faculty led at AU, are they more, do they, in terms of like, do they go to Europe? Are the destinations in Europe as well, or is it, can you see some more decolonial trends in the destinations that are offered?
Yep. So looking at the past suite of faculty-led programs we've sent abroad, a lot of them have gone to Europe, not all of them. Actually, the two most common destinations for faculty-led programs are Central America or Europe. So we have a lot of programs that go to Costa Rica. We've had programs that went to Belize, places like that. Teresa Gunn's program, the Beans, Bananas, and Business, goes over international business and the ecotourism piece in Costa Rica. So those are common and popular destinations. Still, a lot of them do go to Europe. We don't have many faculty-led programs that go to Africa. We have had a couple in the past that have gone to Asia, but we don't have any that go right now.
Thank you.
Let me bring you the microphone for Zoom. On the note of a short-term study abroad, I feel like vacations also, international vacations, the one time I've done it to a country where I don't speak the language, the background noise was super disorienting.
Definitely.
And that was an experience in and of itself.
Yeah, I had you mentioned that Costa Rica offered this excellent program for only $12,000 a semester. And, recognizing the real need, I think it's also crucial to push semester long or ideally year-long study abroad programs. To what extent can't the study abroad programs push certain parts of the world that would be less costly? I mean, when I think of, Turkey, where I was just living last year, everything costs a quarter, a third what it would cost in the West. And I know Latin America, of course, there are many countries that you could at least in theory do programs for significantly less cost. So I'm wondering, to what extent is that a way to attract students, right? If you could get the cost down and attract students just out of pragmatic financial reasons.
Yeah, and that definitely is one of the main selling points that we use for some of these destinations. A lot of study abroad companies will actually have a list of programs under $15,000, programs under $10,000, so that students who are high need, who are really looking for that financial support, who don't have a lot of extra money to spend, can focus in on these locations. So that definitely is an important factor to just promote. It's more affordable. Same experience, good classes, but you aren't going to be in debt for it.
All right, it's coming up on a little after 1 o'clock. I think it's what we have time for. Great question session, great lecture. Thank you very much. And let's thank Laura again.
Thank you all.